Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Today's scripture is from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. May the Lord bless the reading and the hearing of his word.
If you've been with us over the past few weeks, you know that our sermon series is focused on what it means to participate in a bountiful harvest. We've been reminded that what we might see as burden could be, and oftentimes is, blessing. We've also reflected on the abundant richness in our lives and been challenged to ask ourselves, what is enough? This week we're exploring rest and what it might look like to create a rhythm of rest in our lives. What do you think of when you hear the word rest? Any of these images? Well, the Oxford Dictionary has this to say. When used as a verb, rest means to cease work or movement in order to relax, refresh, or recover strength. When rest is used as a noun, it is an instance or period of relaxing or ceasing to engage in strenuous or stressful activity. Oxford gives us the secular concept of rest. There's also a way to think theologically or biblically about rest, and the biblical word for rest is Sabbath, which is derived from 3 Hebrew words: Sabbat, which means ceasing activity; Nuah, which is the absence of movement; and Sakat, which translates to finding tranquility and the absence of external pressure and inner anxiety. Sabbath is a tricky concept for us 21st century humans. We're so busy and so connected, it's difficult to disconnect. We tend to see Sabbath as optional, or we conflate Sabbath with self-care. And until I started reflecting for this sermon, I'd sort of repressed the fact that keeping Sabbath is one of God's 10 commandments. But it's probably the commandment we feel least obligated to observe. I mean, after all, who suffers if I choose not to rest? Just me, right? Would any of us argue that the 10 commandments are optional? Nope, okay. Well, since the commandments are not optional, keeping the Sabbath is not an optional directive. We've done a disservice to the biblical text when we say, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Did you realize that the 4th commandment is actually the longest and most descriptive commandment of the 10? Let's take a look. The first 3 commandments tell us how to relate with God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make idols. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. The Sabbath commandment transitions our instruction for godly living from how we relate with God to how we relate with ourselves and others. That transition begins with an in-depth instruction about how to rest. No working on the Sabbath. Keep it holy just as God, your God, commanded you. Work 6 days, doing everything you have to do. But the seventh day is a Sabbath, a rest day, no work, not you, your son, your daughter, your servant, your maid, your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, and not even the foreigner visiting your town. That way your servants and maids will get the same rest as you. Don't ever forget that you were slaves in Egypt, and God, your God, got you out of there in a powerful show of strength. That's why God, your God, commands you to observe the day of Sabbath. Now, the remaining commandments continue to address how we relate in community. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet. In the biblical record for today, we join the Israelites who have lived in bondage for some 400 years and then wandered around in the wilderness for 40 additional years. Having been an enslaved people is what they know how to do. It's the way they've always lived. It's their way of life. And it's a mindset that's been embedded in their heritage and is deeply rooted in their psyche. When in reality, they are no longer owned by a master and locked into a system that dictates their worth solely by what they produce. God has not only freed them from bondage, God has chosen them as his own people and created a covenant of care with them. Now they are free. They must learn how God's people live in community alongside other free people, in covenant with God and not Pharaoh as their master. And the 10 Commandments are their guide. The first 3 commandments take the Israelites out of slavery. The Sabbath command takes slavery out of the people. God commands the people to cease activity and find tranquility. 1 and 7, God says, you stop all work. You do this as a reminder that you are not defined by your output. 1 day in 7, everyone rests, and all the things you do to define your value and measure your worth cease. Whether you're old, young, rich, poor, slave, free, citizen, or foreigner, you're all simply and completely human beings alongside one another, all beloved children of God. There's the rhythm that God commands. Did you get it? When are we commanded to rest? You get it, talk back to me. 1 day in 7. This may be what makes this commandment so difficult to observe. We must do it regularly. That takes commitment. That takes discipline. It's right here, though. God tells us we must regularly step out of the mindset and activity of the world around us, the measuring, comparing, competing, striving, producing, consuming. We must regularly stop doing and practice just being. My husband and I live in a wooded area of town, and in the summer and fall, when we're outside a lot, we almost always notice the rhythm of the wildlife around us. There's a time shortly before dusk when there's this cacophony of bird calls as they move from one feeder or one tree to the next. They're telling one another what they found during the day. They're claiming their territory. They're issuing mating calls so that their partners know where to find them when they bed down for the evening. This happens every day at dusk. It's a noticeable rhythm. Just as all other creatures and the very ground upon which we stand already do, we need to surrender to cycles of rest and renewal because God has intentionally built those into the fabric of our existence. 1 day in 7, we've been commanded to intentionally remember, you are not God. Purposefully, we are to rest as a way to acknowledge that we are neither better nor worse than any other person around us, and that we are all connected in this mutual belonging to God and to each other. This is what it means to be a faithful human. This is what it means to be free. But it's so easy to forget this part of our covenant relationships. While we seek meaning for our lives, forces around us constantly seek to influence and shape how we make meaning. A constant barrage of messages through multiple 24/7 media platforms assure connectivity, and an overload of information that invades our opportunity to rest, strips us of our freedom to just be, compromises our compassion, and pulls us into this relentless loop of division, ranking, judging, striving, measuring. Add to that email, texting, phones ever at the ready, and we often believe and behave as though the world can't run without our constant attention and comment. But it can. And God commands that it must. One day in 7. Sabbath is one of God's top 10 because unless we regularly stop to rest and reflect, we forget that God is God and we are not. We forget that we are creatures created with bodies and minds and hearts that require the love and care of a creator who is really ready to meet us when we stop long enough to be met. We forget that we are in this together alongside everyone else, and we need one another because life isn't meant to be done alone or at warp speed. And rest is not a reward to be earned, it's a starting point. The Jewish Sabbath day begins at sundown, and when the Sabbath day arrives, everything stops. Whether you are ready or not, Sabbath interrupts and takes over. Notice you don't start Sabbath after all the work is done. The house is clean, the leaves are raked, the gutters are cleared, and thank you notes are in the mail. When the sun hits the horizon, you just simply stop. The phone goes silent, devices go dark, the work is put down so that the only thing left is human beings being human in the presence of God. The God who has been there all along, but gone largely unnoticed until we allow ourselves to rest in Sabbath. God gives us the command to rest because it doesn't come naturally to us. To rest, we must trust that God will take care of things for us. We must trust that if we take a day off, the world will not stop turning. You know, from the time in the garden when we humans decided we could act in God's place and make all the decisions, humanity has become more tense and less able to relax. It was disobedience in the garden that started this problematic plummet into busyness that we've not been able to let go. But I believe also that it's obedience to the command to observe Sabbath that will decrease the influence of external pressures, reduce inner anxiety, and aid us in creating a rhythm of rest. It sounds easy, but I know that it's not. And by now, I'm sure you're looking for some suggestions about how to rest. Before I make some suggestions, I have a confession. I'm great at self-care. I'll go get a massage or facial or mani or pedi or go to my chiropractor regularly. But the truth is, I wedge those snippets of respite self-care into my otherwise busy days, and I deceive myself into believing that that's Sabbath. That is not honoring the Sabbath. The truth is, I haven't set aside a day for Sabbath in a very long time. So how can we, as a community of people who want to live out our God-given identities, create rhythms of Sabbath rest? Rest. God gives us permission to work 6 days. Work 6. Work hard. Rest 1. Rest well. Trust that God has everything under control. Believe God will make provision for whatever is left undone. Plan your rest. Choose one day of the week that you can regularly rest. Your day of rest doesn't have to be a Sunday, but it should be a day that consistently works for you. This creating of a rhythm will set a pattern in your mind and your body that will benefit your soul and deepen your faith. Observing Sabbath rest in a regular rhythm allows us to acknowledge our own frailty and honor God's provident care. Relax. This is personal. What is relaxing for one of us might not be relaxing for another. If you're an introvert, you might prefer a quiet walk in nature or time alone and find that recharging. Extroverts, on the other hand, might want to spend some time with their favorite people. Each person's way to relax will look different, and that's the beauty of the commandment. It leaves room for diversity and creativity. It's just your being refreshed that will glorify the God who created you. And lastly, reconnect. Creating Sabbath is God's strategy for helping us to remember that God is God and we are not. That we are human beings made in God's image for love and connection, and not for being locked into this never-ending competition for worth and resources. Use your Sabbath to reconnect with yourself, with others, and most importantly, with the God who created you. I serve on the Indiana Conference Board of Ordained Ministry for our church. A few weeks ago, the board met at Our Lady of Fatima for our annual retreat. During a break between dinner and evening worship, I found myself walking the labyrinth. Now, my brain needed a rest from the day's activities, and I find that walking the pattern of pathways that get you to the center of a labyrinth allows me to rest, relax, and reconnect with God. Now, that's not Sabbath, but it's a way for me to reflect on what my Sabbath might look like. When I got to the center of the labyrinth, I found stones with words for burdens people had left behind. Words like fear, frustration, exhaustion, insecurity. We just turned back our clocks, and hopefully you started the day feeling a little more rested. This week is an ideal opportunity to begin to practice your own Sabbath. I hope that by now you have a thankfulness journal. If you don't, you can get them at the rear of the sanctuary or someplace around church, or even download one from online. I encourage you to choose a day that you will observe your Sabbath and use that day to begin observing a practice of rest. I want you to commit to that for 3 weeks. I want you to consult your journal for additional ideas on how you might practice Sabbath. And I want you to share your plan with someone else and invite them to practice Sabbath rest with you. That way you have an accountability partner in this new practice. This command to observe Sabbath is uncomfortable. We are trained to measure the worth of a day by what we accomplish. What do we do with a day when the goal is to not accomplish? Expect there to be restlessness. There may be tears. Emotions that you've had pushed down may surface in the space that you've created to reflect and notice that God is sitting beside you. But consider whatever happens, and you're creating a rhythm of rest through observing Sabbath to be part of letting go, letting God, and expressing gratitude for the bountiful harvest that God has already given. Amen.